Well, welcome everybody. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for taking some time out of your lunch breaks to learn and join us for our food systems perspectives webinar this afternoon. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Lauren Bernardi. I am the provincial manager of the Rise Up program. Super happy to be here, calling in today from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, particularly the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. So we've got a jam-packed hour for you all. Very excited. But before we get started, just want to acknowledge the greater lands that we are calling all jointly in from. And acknowledge that our program, with deep gratitude, is thanks to its stewardship from Indigenous peoples across what is now known as British Columbia. As an organization that works in the intersection of public health, stewardship, and community well-being, we're grateful that the land and waters have been cared for since time immemorial by diverse nations whose sovereignty, cultures, and ways of knowing continue to shape these territories today and into the future. We recognize that our work goes beyond the places we live and impacts the lives of nations, not just across the province, but all of Turtle Island, what is now known as North America. Thanks, Marcus. Next slide. So some of you, again, we know from your involvement in the Rise Up program so far, but we would love to hear about where you're calling in from today. So if you could open up your chat boxes, throw in your name, the traditional and the colonial place name where you're calling in from. That would be so lovely because it's really exciting to see what kind of representation we have across the province. So as you do that, I'm going to continue on so we make sure we're staying on schedule here. So next slide there, Marcus. So before we hop into that and I pass it over to Marcus, just a couple quick housekeeping things. For those of you that, again, just joined us, you're welcome to keep your cameras on or turn them off, totally up to you. Love to see your smiling faces, but we also recognize it's lunchtime, so you might be munching in the background, and that's totally fine. So this is a panel discussion. We have some wonderful questions that I know a lot of you had put into the Eventbrite when you registered. They're awesome. We don't have time to address all of those questions in today's session, but we will have a little bit of space to do some Q&A as well. So as your questions pop up, feel free to put them in the chat. And Marcus, as the moderator, will try his best to address those with the panelists this afternoon. And then for whatever questions we can't get to today, we'll make sure to follow up either on Heartbeat or in an email. Okay, I think that's it from me. So I am going to humbly pass it over to our colleague, Marcus. Thanks, Marcus.
Hi, everyone. Very excited about the session that we have today. We have three panelists that will be joining us, Fred Fortier, Chris Bodner, and Richard Hahn. And what the goal really was of this session, we called it Food Systems Perspectives, was just to show how complex and unique food systems really are, depending on what the backgrounds are, what your experience is. And so it's really a discussion-based panel with the goal of having fluid conversation amongst the panelists. As mentioned, if you have questions that you want to put in to the chat, we'll do our best. We have 5 or 6 core questions that we've created on slides, but certainly we can branch off from there. It just really depends on how rich each one gets. So we're going to go in this order. At first, I just wanted to give each panelist the opportunity just to give themselves a little introduction, where they're joining us from, a little bit about how they got into food systems work, and what brought them here today. So I'll start with passing it over to Fred Fortier.
Fred Fortier in West Wetmacink, Ilkapma. So I'm Fred Fortier. I'm a descendant of the Sinch Wetmac people and the Ilkapma people from my mom's side. I've been dealing with food sovereignty, I think, all my life from an early age of picking berries, and my grandma and grandpa showed me fishing, hunting as well. And so I've been dealing with the whole pile of things as far as, on the land stuff, and continue to do that. And I have a real passion for dealing with the hothouse businesses and market gardens, and that's what I do for a living, amongst other stuff.
Thanks so much, Fred. I will pass it over now to Chris Bodner to give a little introduction where he's joining from today and how he got into food systems that brought him to this point.
Hello, I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Stolo people in Chilliwack. And I got involved in food systems through a lot of different little paths over many years. So getting really interested in food issues while I was in university, Had the opportunity to volunteer with some really interesting community organizations, and eventually had the opportunity to be mentored by someone who was retiring as a farmer and ended up taking on his farming operation. I farmed for 18 years in Abbotsford doing mixed vegetables and recently started teaching in the agriculture program at the University of the Fraser Valley. So it's been a long sort of circuitous route.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. Now I'll pass it off to Richard, who I've worked with for a number of years now. If you can give a little introduction, where you're showing up from and how did you get into food systems and what brought you to now?
Thanks, Marcus. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Hahn. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, and Kwantlen First Nation. I work with PHABC as a Senior Director of Public and Planetary Health. I would say my journey to food systems has been quite unconventional and quite different. I was never, somebody who was, passionate about food systems from an early age. But what I was passionate about was making a difference in society and in people's lives. I wanted to promote equity through supporting marginalized and vulnerable populations. So in my early days, I did some work with First Nations communities. I got to see some of the challenging and different conditions that, are, I guess, different Canadian populations on reserve live versus those living in urban and otherwise different settings. And I wanted to make a difference and I wanted to do something about it. So the food systems work kind of landed at my table through kind of my passion through community development. But yeah, that's kind of how I started, and I'm happy to share more.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for introducing yourselves. So we're going to jump right into it. I'm just going to hold this slide up just for 1 second, but we will copy this question into the chat. We wanted to do so we could have your face, the panelists who are speaking, be the main focus of attention and not just the question sitting up there. So the first one, this was actually a question that Fred brought up when we met before this webinar. The question is, what does food sovereignty mean to you? And what are the barriers in your experience? So we'll pass that over into the chat. Thank you. I see that it's there. And I will stop sharing for a moment. And it's just free discussion for anyone, Fred, Chris, or Richard, who would want to jump in and go for it. You can also put up your hand too if you want to begin, if you want to go in an order.
So what does food sovereignty mean to me? And what are the barriers? And how are the food systems framework different? So to me, I think that food sovereignty means full control as to what I grow, what seeds I use, what nutrients I use. And when we talk about food sovereignty, there must be food sort of justice that I talk about and other people talk about, where our gathering areas for, the berries, the ungulates, and the medicines that we take from the land have to be free of spraying of chemicals. And that's not the case in my territory or any other parts of British Columbia. So I think that's from a perspective of sovereignty, meaning having control of it, full control, so that no one else can sort of interfere with that. The other point I wanted to make was, since we've been dealing with a lot of First Nations issues around the province, and so we did a report that came out through Jacob Beacon from Tea Creek, and he did a report on behalf of First Nations he went to talk to a lot of people across the province. And it was interesting what the framework for the food sovereignty was from an Indigenous perspective. And I just wanted to go through that. So they talked about traditional foods, going back to the traditional foods, the berries, the fish, the ungulates, the bear, and all of the things that are on the land that we used to eat and don't eat now, including, like gophers and whatnot, because they're very healthy. The other one was around food security. And that's when I talk about, and other people talk about, food justice, is that we can't have our food being sprayed when when we eat those foods on a regular basis throughout the winters and pick them during the springtime and summertime. And so I think we need to make sure that our foods are healthy when we get them, because, there's a lot of cancer related issues with First Nations. The other area was around medicines. And I'm a medicine picker. I make medicines, I work with the community on making medicines. I provide medicine workshops with the communities and other communities. The medicine was part of that framework. And as the other part was just nutrition. And a lot of elders talked about that, how nutrition our berries were compared to other berries that you buy from the store. And one of the interesting things, or it's just this saying that we have or have heard before. And for those who have elders, grandmas and grandpas and elders that they might look up to and look after, is that they're saying that eat your food as medicine or you will eat your medicine as food. And the amount of pills that we get, our elders get, is a sign of that. So those are my thoughts around what does food sovereignty mean to you. Quick stem.
Thanks, Fred.
I'll jump in, and I appreciate Fred's words in that introduction to food sovereignty. The thing that I've learned and going back again to Jacob at Tea Creek, as someone who I think has really done a lot of work to expand on this, is that food sovereignty is intrinsically linked to land sovereignty, and that these aren't separate issues. It's about like cultural autonomy. It's about the ability to, like, when the term food security has been used a lot, and that just to measure, do people have enough food, access to food, like enough calories? And it doesn't necessarily ask the question, is it appropriate food? Is it culturally relevant food? Do people have choice in what they're eating? And are they involved in where they're, like, whether it's harvesting, growing, knowing where their food is from? And so food sovereignty, I think, is a really powerful concept to reframe how we think about food, but more than the food, the intersection of the culture and the land. And I think, I mean, from my exposure to it, it's an open door to learning a lot more. Like, it's not just about food, but it's really about people and how do we relate to each other? How do we interact with each other? How do we empower each other?
Yeah, thanks, Fred and Chris. And to jump off of that, food definitely is a connector. I consider myself a foodie. I think we all love food, which is why we're all here today. If I can share a little bit about my ancestry and where I come from, my parents and I guess we immigrated from Korea back in 97. And my mom's side is from, I guess, what is now known as North Korea. And I think about some of the ways that some countries control people through food, right? Through food scarcity. There's a quote that I am reminded of, is that he who controls food controls the people. And to be able to, and for food sovereignty for me is about, as Fred mentioned, that control, the autonomy, the ability and the empowerment to being able to have control over our own and sovereignty over our food choices. I remember when I first immigrated, the first thing that my parents did, and I did not know that they had this knowledge back in the day, was they started to grow their own food. I did not know that they had a green thumb. I did not know that they knew how to grow food, but that was the first thing that they did when they immigrated, not only for food security purposes, but also because the food that they had available at home was not available here. And so just an example, they grew perilla leaves, which is very common on the East Asian cuisine. My parents use it to marinate in soy sauce, and it serves as like a side dish that goes well with rice. They also grow peas and a lot of Asian plants in our backyard. And they would always tell me that food systems and food sovereignty is very important. And they would always urge me to eat every grain of rice and every bean, because there were a lot of hands and a lot of sweat and tears that went into making the food. And so I think a lot about food sovereignty in how it empowers people, how it's important for us as societies to self-determine our own food systems, what makes us feel good. There's certainly food that makes me feel good that I consider soul food to me. I know that's different for everybody, but there is such a deeper connection to food beyond what feeds us and what keeps us full. And so I think that really is integral in the notion of food sovereignty as well.
Yeah, all great answers. Really brings us back to really what's at the core of food and food sovereignty being the land and access to it, and the maintaining of the cultural and the connection to it, and that it's hard to separate it from sort of the political components of it. What do we see, maybe quickly, maybe we can just have one of you speak to this, because it kind of segues well into the next one. But what are the barriers? And I know this is a big question, but it will help us move into the next question after. What do you see as the primary barrier? If maybe Fred or Chris or Richard would like to speak to it.
I advise the Minister of Agriculture in British Columbia as an Indigenous person. And what I've been really promoting within our group is the impacts legislation and policy from the province of British Columbia and federal government as well on our food sovereignty processes. And And a lot of people in the province of British Columbia, the provincial people, agencies, really don't like me to talk about that. When we talk about what are the impacts to our ungulates, for instance, and I call it horn management versus genetic management. Our laws, Secwepemc laws, and I'm a Secwepemc, are based upon our coyote laws. Those laws are specific to how we deal with ungulate management. So instead of harvesting the bounty that's there, does, the young bucks, we're killing off our genetics by going after the big deer, the big moose, the big elk. And so we're watering down our genetics. So that's why I call it horn management. It's not conservation management or any other kind of management. It's not respecting the genetics of those animals. So I think that's, and there's lots of more barriers that I see in provincial and federal legislation. One of them is the access is a huge one for us on private lands. Some people allow us to go onto private lands. Other ones say, get the hell off and stay off. Spraying is another one, but the injustice that goes on the land against our ability to go out and harvest on a regular basis. And I could go on and on about a lot of other barriers, but I think those are specific ones. Like the Ministry of Forest has a lot of barriers to us around the way that they do the prescriptions for the forestry license. It goes against our principles of management. And I keep telling this story about why you'd want to cut all the birch down. Birch is an indicator species of good health, how you're managing the land. It gives you access, the birds access to food. It gives us access to bark, gives us access to chaga, it gives us access to birch water. It gives ability to protect some of the birds. It builds soil. And so there's a lot of things that are related to just the birch tree alone, and they're cutting them down and just leaving them. So, and that's a specific issue. So hope that's provided some advice.
I'll move into question 2. I think it's a good segue that comes out of that question right there. So I'll just share my screen quickly just to show what it is, but we'll also put it in the chat. But what is one radical thing we can do to create a shift in the food system? I'd like to maybe shift this question for our presenters, though, because we do have a question in closing that proposes out to youth. Maybe the question I would like to pose is, what's one radical thing you have done that could have created maybe a shift in the food system, something that you felt you yourself have participated in? And you can see the question there in the chat in case you want to get the wording of it. Yeah, maybe I'll ask Chris to lead this one, if that's okay.
Sure. I think that the radical thing, it's maybe not radical, but it's something that we don't do often enough, is to share a meal with someone you don't know. I first had an experience, like I grew up and my family I understood what our food was and what we grew and so on. And in high school, I had a meal with a friend whose family came from Hong Kong. And we just had this moment of like, oh, your food is really different. And both of us were shocked because we lived so much of our life in this really, I guess, family bubble. And I find that if we can sit down and we can share a meal together, there's so much we can learn about each other, but also about the food. And it's something like in running a farm, in delivering community supported agriculture boxes, people often say like, oh, I have too much food. What should I do with it? And it's like, well, have you shared any? Like, have you given some to your neighbors? And people are shocked. And they're like, well, no, I wouldn't do that. And it surprises me how much people aren't like, you're not willing to share food. I think it's just such an important thing that we can do with each other to learn about each other, to build those connections, and that food is part of that. So I don't know if it's really radical, but I think it's probably something we don't do often enough.
Thanks, Chris. Richard.
Yeah, I won't take all the credit for it because there were a lot of people involved, but creating this program, the Rise Up program, is something that I contributed to in the early days, including the blueprint of it. Granted, there were funding stipulations on, youth volunteerism, but bringing it into this food systems mix under the Public Health Association of BC, connecting to different schools, our partners, our nonprofit partners and businesses, it was quite the undertaking, and it's really interesting to see how ideas can come into fruition and create an amazing opportunity like this to being able to share about our experiences and our perspectives within food systems. I really do believe that, we can all go further if we're working together. I know the previous question was around how can we create shift in food systems? If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far and make a real transformative impact, go together. And I think what we're doing right now is on that food systems transformation journey together. And a program like the Rise Up program that I'm proud to be a part of creates spaces for us to have these conversations, to connect, and to be able to have, to be able to make plans around how we want to shift our future societies, how we want to make it sustainable, how we want to make it more just. And so, yeah, I'm proud of this program. And I know that there's going to be more ripple effects to come as a legacy of this program. And I know that more youth will be coming through. And I hope that some of the experiences and the sharings of today and all that you will experience throughout your cohort will kind of live in your memories. And hopefully it'll come back in your 20s and your 30s where you can look back at today and some of the volunteer placements that you're a part of and how it's going to help shift our food systems to a better place.
Thank you, Richard. Fred, any thoughts on that? I imagine you've done many interventions or examples of so-called radical work in the food system. Have any to share at this moment?
Well, I think grow your own food or get a place to grow your own food is a good start for anyone. I run into people who say, I wish I could garden. I'm saying, well, come and see me for a day. And after that, you'll probably get into it because the things that I do in a garden are incredible and the things that I can grow. So, that knowledge that I have is trying to put it forward to other people. The gardening is not a hard thing to do, right? You just got to be able to do things. And I always said that if you're going to be a gardener, be a lazy gardener. And so the other one is participate in community gardens. There's lots of community gardens around in about every city, every community. The other thing is buy local and support the local businesses. Volunteer in garden activities with communities. I mean, there's lots of different things. And as well, dealing with the food bank and maybe volunteer in the food bank because it's interesting. I've been tracking the food banks, for the last while. We have one in our own community. I live in a community we call Chuchwa, but it's right beside Barrier, BC, like 16 kilometers. And I have a great relationship with the food bank. So I sell them produce, but I also give them a lot of produce too, and one of my rules as a grower is that I don't like to throw away any food. So, if I have extra vegetables somewhere, I'll just donate them to the school, donate them to the bank, or give it to people who can't afford to buy things. And what I've really noticed in the last probably 3 years is that there's a lot of people who can't afford to buy vegetables at the cost that we're selling it at. So, that's an issue, I think. Good stuff.
Thank you, Fred. Awesome. I'm going to move on to question number 3. Share it up on the screen and we'll also add it into the chat. So, can encouraging a positive emotional connection with nature or the land among the general population contribute to a sustainable food system? Along with this question was sort of the notion that with more and more populations living in urban environments and the depletion of natural spaces in urban environments, it's difficult for people to have a strong connection to the land and see its value in all the things related to food systems. I would love to hear your own thoughts on that. Maybe Richard, would you like to maybe give a little go to start this one up?
Sure, sounds good. I mean, personally, I love being out in nature. It's my teacher, it's my nurturer, it's my therapist and a friend. I think about all that nature offers me, and nature in return asks only that I leave my footprint behind. I know a lot of hikers and those who like being outdoors have that mantra as we step out into the natural environment. And personally, as a parent, I think about my kids and the future generation and how I want them to enjoy what I have. And so absolutely, like whether it's just being out in nature to go on a hike or being out in a community garden and being in that natural environment, I think there's so much that nature and our environment and what it offers us. We have to have that deeper appreciation for what it offers us. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that a positive emotional connection with nature will contribute to sustainable food systems because we have to be able to preserve our natural environment for the next generation. And how can we do that without a food system that isn't sustainable? I know there was mention around in the comment as well too around food waste and about the greenhouse emissions. And it's almost a crime that I think more than half of our food that is produced in Canada goes to waste. And so think about how much food that we produce as a nation and how little of it and how many people are starving. Fred, you talked about the food bank. I think the food hunger count was released by Food Banks Canada, and it's another record-setting number again, right? So I think we have to really ask ourselves a lot of hard questions around why are we in the state that we're in, even though we have so much abundance, what's contributing to the system that we have at play, and what can we do to shift those systems? And I do believe that our connection with the environment, our appreciation, and our willingness to preserve the environment and to combat climate change is going to be a part of the solution to the sustainable food systems and to a better society as a whole.
I'll say that when I was started farming, I would get really frustrated with certain things that would happen. And the example I'll give are ravens and crows coming through and pulling out plants. And so I would go down to the field and there would be a whole row of plants pulled out. And I would think of the crows and the ravens and I'd just be like, what jerks? Like they're just pulling out plants for fun. And eventually I realized that what they were doing was pulling out plants and they were eating the worms off the roots. And it was a sign that there was something else going on in the soil. And they had just figured out where the good high protein snacks were. And so they weren't pulling out plants out of spite for fun or something, but there was actually another message there, and that like those plants would have died anyway with that infestation on the roots. And so there was something else to understand going on there. And without being able to take a look back, like a larger perspective on what are the systems that and the relationships in the natural world around us, we often make really simplistic assumptions about what's going on. And we find tools to solve those problems which are not appropriate to what the root of the problem is. And so I think that's a really good example of how having a stronger relationship with the natural world benefits us in a lot of ways of finding more sustainable solutions to any number of problems, our food system being one of them.
Anything to add on your end with that question, Fred?
Yeah, so I think we need to be able to provide a program to kids at a young age in elementary school, even the moccasin. We have a place we call moccasins. I don't know if anybody else, but it's a First Nation sort of a daycare. And so earlier on, when my youngest daughter was 3 years old, I think, or 4, when she started the little moccasins, my wife would invite the kids up into our garden. And so that was 40 years ago. My daughter now, I have 4 kids, but the oldest one being around 49. I think my son's 47 or something like that. And I had a heck of a time to get that young man out to do anything in the garden. He just hated it. But I found out that, when he got to the age of 30 or so, he started growing his garden. And I couldn't believe the amount of produce he was growing. And because I said, oh, he must have been watching me at times when I was gardening. So, I think we need to do that at a lower grade level and right from the start all the way to, high school. And as well, I think the universities play a huge role in developing programs with the regenerative gardening and regenerative organic gardening, I would say, because such as the TRU, Regenerative Agriculture Program, 2-year program that has been developed and is focused on regenerative agriculture. And I teach part of that with them as an instructor to deal with the hothouse management, which gets into a whole pile of different things, as well as soil, bug management, and so forth, heating, irrigation, and all of those things. So I think and universities are doing that. There's a lot of universities now getting into that. The UBC's got one, I was down in their garden area and talking with them. So, I think that there's a couple more around Lower Fraser area, Chilliwack, that doing that. So I think it has to start there at a university level, because when we get people out of that program, instead of going to a horticulture program that just teaches you about, how to manage grass or manage an area for a city, or, so it's industry driven. And so I think that has to change. I also think that there needs to be these farms that are set up to educate and teach regenerative gardening techniques, such as, Tea Creek in Terrace area. Dixon Terbasket down in Karamias is doing that. Myself, who do that on a regular basis, I have people that come up and visit me and say, oh, I wish I could do that amount. And so I think it's that whole providing that expertise and showing how it can be done that it is important to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. The segue is pretty good into our next question, actually. If you're interested in continuing to have the mic, we have about 10 minutes left and we have 3 questions, including this one. So we have about 3 minutes for each one approximately. But how can we transition to a regenerative food system rather than one that damages and degrades the ecosystems? And so that will be put in the chat there too as a reminder. But yeah, I wonder, Fred, I know you were just speaking on regenerative agriculture. Chris, you've also got a background in farming. So I wonder if you two might be able to speak to this not an easy topic to tackle.
Sure. I think that there's a lot of people who have no sort of emotional connection to the land or the environment. And I guess I would call them concrete warriors, because, they live in a concrete world. And I think everyone needs to connect to the environment. You don't have to be a tree hugger, and you just need to connect, go out and see what the environment gives you as far as peace, well-being, and just share the environment with your soul. I think that's important. Romanticizing the land is not an option, I think. Let's not romanticize the land. We could do this and do that. Land provides us with everything we need in life. Everything. Medicines, food, tranquility. It goes on and on. So I think as well, there's no sort of spiritual connection to the land, when people give in our way, and I'm a Shwakama person, is to be able to give thanks to the creator, Kalkukbi, and thank them for providing you with that food and making that offering. I think that's important from at least my perspective as a Shwapmak and Lakapmo person. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that, there are, like, in transitioning to a regenerative cycle of agriculture, we've had a very extractive relationship with agriculture and with treatment of the land, and like this idea that growing is like a chemical process. Like we just need this much nitrogen and we'll be able to generate like a healthy plant. And what we see over time is like our ability to function as humanity depends on maintaining this really thin, like a few inches of soil. And when we degrade that, we will lose our ability to feed ourselves. And so there's a real care that's necessary for that. But then the other side of it is that, like, we know from research, like in the States, the USDA has tracked this for decades, the nutrient content of food. And we know that we need to eat like twice as many apples today to get the same nutritional value as an apple in the 1950s. And what's changed over that time is a much more chemically dependent form of growing food. And so we don't have the same, like we're growing food that's like big, that's colorful, that's sweet and such, but we're doing that in a way that does not provide nutrient dense food and that degrades the soils that we're growing in. So how do we transition? I mean, we have guidebooks. We've been doing this for a long time, but right here in our place, I think if we go back to the concept of food sovereignty, maybe one of the things that we can look at is the fact that our idea of agriculture is very European based. And going back, even the paper that was mentioned earlier on food sovereignty, that came out of Tea Creek, that was a real challenge to get that paper released publicly, because as soon as there was an acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples practiced a form of landscape management that could be equated to agriculture, that gets a lot of people in government really scared, because it reminds them that the lands here have been cared for 10,000 years and more. And that there's so many lessons to be learned there. And this idea that agriculture needs to look the same all around the world is problematic, because we have so many different places, so many different ecosystems, ecologies, the plants that are native to a place, the people who've tended them, those are all parts of what regeneration looks like. And I think that right now, the exciting things that, like the work that's going on, and I'll just mention at University of the Fraser Valley, we have a very strong relationship with the Stolo peoples, in that the university we have, like, in our modern languages department, we have a contingent of faculty that are Ho'okame'olem speakers and teachers. We have an expectation that there's Indigenous ways of knowing in all of our courses. And in agriculture, we understand that we're not just regenerating agriculture. It's not just about food. It's about regenerating ways of knowing. It's about regenerating culture. It's about regenerating language. And that universities have been used, and our entire education system has been used as a way of trying to erase those histories and erase that knowledge. And that there's a responsibility now that we rebuild that. And I think that that's part of when we look at what does regeneration look like in our food system. Again, it's about all of those relationships. It's about all those ways of knowing, and that we have so much more work to do, but it's exciting because it's a challenge, and it's about building something. It's about doing something positive.
Amazing responses from both. I could see this being an entire webinar just on its own, that topic right there. Thank you so much for those really thoughtful responses. We have 2 more questions to go, not very much time left, so maybe we'll keep this pretty tight. In particular, this question, because I think the final question which Fred had posed, I do want to have a little bit more opportunity. So I wanted to propose this one maybe over to Richard. You've worked a lot in different types of food systems in many different capacities: food literacy, food access. Should food continue to be a product commodity, or should we push it to be a fundamental human right? And if so, what do you think can be done to start that transition?
Oh, I found this to be the hardest question to answer because there's so many ways of going about it. And I would also encourage Fred and Chris to chime in if there's time. But
sure.
maybe where I'll start off with is what I had mentioned about just the amount of food that goes to waste in our society. So, we have this machine that turns out more food than we can ever consume, more than double, in fact. I think about 56, I checked the stats yesterday. I think it was 56% or 58% of the food that's produced in Canada goes to waste throughout the supply chain, whether it be at the grocery stores because the food just didn't look right, in our fridges because we ended up overbuying or not being able to use it for whatever reason. Or maybe we read the label and it said a best before date, and we decided that, due to misunderstanding or lack of knowledge, that it wasn't good enough. So we decided to throw it away. Or somewhere along the way, when a farmer is unable to, maybe exceeds the quota, and so has to throw away some of the food. And so I think about, yes, food as a human right, as in there's more than enough food that's out there. And so the question is, why isn't it getting to the people that need it most? When we have people using record numbers of people lining up at the food banks, when we have so many people that are turned away, and some conditions that are being made at certain food access organizations just because there isn't enough food to go around, we have to start asking ourselves, why is this the case? And what are we doing as a society to make sure that we're meeting the basic needs of all people, right? Thinking about just the United Nations declarations, just the right to a roof over your head, right to food, right to clothing. I mean, those are the 3 basic essential things that we need. I know that in my work, there has been a lot of organizations that have taken up on this work and have done what's called food recovery. So they're diverting food waste or food that would have otherwise gone to the dumpster and giving it to people. And while that is very important work, it's still a Band-Aid solution. And I think about more of an upstream approach of what we can do to make sure that food doesn't even get to that place in the first point. A part of it is education and knowledge. I think a bigger part of it is the need for us to speak up to our, conglomerate grocery chains and these large corporations that have a lot of influence and sway in what we eat, how much we pay, what's available, what we see. There's a lot of influence that is either very public or very subtle. And so I think there is a responsibility on all of us to be as educated as possible. We live in a very democratic society, and I think that's the part of this Rise Up program is for the youth to have a voice, to have their voices heard about how they want to shape their food systems. I know that the youth of this generation are really concerned about climate change and about the environmental impacts, and that it is important to have sustainable food systems. So what can we do? I think it's very important for all of us to really take actionable steps. It doesn't have to be big. Write a letter to your MLA. Start a letter writing campaign. Do what you think is right to help shift this forward. And just another side thing that I'll throw in there is the idea of what's known as universal basic income, a certain level of income to make sure that all people have some sort of money that's available to being able to purchase food that is just, that is dignified. Is it possible for food to not become a commodity? I think so. I think it'll be very hard if we live in a utopian society, but I do think that there are solutions to help us get there. And hopefully some of the nuggets that I've shared are those examples of pathways to help us to get there, to make sure that all people at all times have access to food.
Thanks, Richard. Chris, do you want to quickly jump in? We've got one last little question. Do we see any questions in the chat box before we go forward yet? Because we do have a question and answer period. Megan, not so far. Okay, Chris, if you'd like, I know you talked a lot about abundance and these ideas around scarcity, so I think you might have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was just thinking we're at the 4-year anniversary of when the floods hit the Fraser Valley, and I mean, entire communities cut off. The Lower Mainland was cut off from the rest of Canada. Roads and railways washed out. And the incredible thing about these moments of emergencies is that all of a sudden there's an incredible abundance. People pull out all the stops. There's food for everyone. There's ways of communities working together. And there's a really positive outcome in a lot of these scenarios that we work really well together. We're cooperative by nature as humans. And that's a story we don't tell enough about ourselves. The reason business functions is because we cooperate together. The way communities function is because we cooperate together. Doesn't mean we always agree. It doesn't mean that we always do it well, but we're social creatures. And I think that we need to tell ourselves stories about that better reflect our human nature. And I think that we're much more inherently good than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And within that, what we need to recognize is that notion of abundance, like that we live in a world, as Richard said, we produce more food than, like we produce enough. I heard it recently for like 3,000 calories per person per day, which is more than most humans need in a day. And yet we don't distribute that well. And I think we have a lot of examples where we do look at food as being an essential item that people should have access to. So like the school food programs that are being rolled out right now, talking about making sure that children aren't hungry because they can't learn when they're hungry, that we have ways of doing this together. I don't know that it means necessarily taking food out of the context of a market. I mean, we trade, and humans have traded for millennia and so on, that we have different ways of valuing things. But it's about how do we collectively build wealth as a society and decide how we share that wealth in terms of the programs that we create together. And that at the end of the day, that's like when we do well as a society, that should give us the ability to work together better. And unfortunately, we like more recently, we've been skewing towards more extreme disparities between the richest and the poorest. And this idea that if you have a lot, then that's because you've done something virtuous to gain lots of money, and that's your right to have lots of money, as opposed to what are responsibilities towards the rest of society. And so I think that that's really important, that abundance. We do have abundance. We just need to recognize it and do better to make sure that abundance is shared.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's really important in today's context with all these billionaires kind of being out there and a lot more control of everything, it seems. We are at only 5 minutes to go here, and I just wanted to make sure there was none of the youth that had any questions, that wanted to bring it forward. We do have a few minutes where if you did, you could put your hand up, or if you did want to put it into the chat. Okay, Jasmine.
Hello, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation so far today. I just kind of wanted to bring up, to me, it feels like there is kind of an elephant in the room when it comes to the profit motive and the incentive structure of the existing food system, because, as someone with like kind of a political science background, I see, there's always, markets can look like a lot of different things and can be designed in many different ways. But clearly the incentive structure that the system that exists right now is the reason why we are in the situation we're in, with, massive consolidations of wealth, land, and power in the hands of a very small group of individuals or corporations. The short term, the priority of short term, overproduction over any sort of long term sustainability, environmentally and in other terms as well. So I'm just wondering how, if you, any of you have any thoughts about how we kind of square this contradiction, because ultimately, under the existing system, every bit of food that is given, that is accessible, is a bit of food that's not sold. And so, is there a way that we can work with corporations to transform, or is the incentive structure and the structure generally of the corporate food system so far off that something new needs to be built from the ground up? So, thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. Wonder if there's any other youth that have a quick question. We have about 1 more minute before we have to transition. I know we did have one last question, and we can float that back over to the team and follow that up in our communications. It was around advice for young people wanting to be involved in that, but I wanted to give it a chance for, if there's one last comment or question for youth, to feel free to jump in. Okay, great. If there is any that come to mind, please do follow up with us after. We can float these back over to the presenters to do so after the point. And Fred, I would love to get that question that you would propose, which would have been the final question to you, because I think you would have some great insights. I'm going to pass it over to Lauren, but first I just really want to thank Fred, Chris, and Richard. Very insightful. We did great with only having about 35 or 40 minutes here to tackle some very big and awesome questions that came from the youth. So yeah, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. I'll pass it over to Lauren to give a closure for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, Chris, Fred, and Richard, for your incredibly valuable insights to, I know, us as a Rise Up team, and also to our Rise Up participants and host organizations that are here with us today. So thank you. There seems to be a kind of an overarching theme of abundance. And I think that's such a good mindset as we're kind of speaking about the next generation and generations to come and sustainability. So thank you again for your inspirational words. And just to follow up on Marcus's point, if you all have a moment, we would love the last question that we were going to ask around advice to young people getting involved in food systems. If you have any answers that you want to jot down, it can be point form that we can send out to everybody. That would be so much appreciated, because I think your words are very valued by everybody here. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. We do have a quick survey. If you've got a couple minutes, please feel free to share any feedback that you have. We will continue on with these webinars. We host one about every 2 to 3 months. And so your feedback is really helpful for us, so that we can make sure that we're actually addressing the topics and the themes that you want to see in the Rise Up program. So you can follow the QR code that's on the screen now. I think Cam may have also put the link in the chat, or will be shortly. So that would be great. Our next webinar, we're TBD on the exact title of it, but will be at the end of January, sometime in there. So keep your eyes peeled for an email. We still use Heartbeat as our main communications, so please keep an eye on that. And then we have recorded the session today. We won't be sharing it with the broader community, but we will send it out to all of you and those that weren't able to make it today as well. So keep an eye on that too. Thank you all so much. We're right on 1 o'clock on the nose. So thank you again to the panelists for being so succinct and still having such a breadth of knowledge and advice to share with us. So thank you, Hachka Siam, to all of you. I raise my hands. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.